welcome to episode 29. I'm Dr. Catherine Hughes from Crime Psych. Welcome back to those who are returning, and welcome if it's your first time here. In today's episode, I'm going to be looking at Steve Wright, who murdered 5 women who worked as sex workers in the latter half of 2006. He killed all 5 women by strangulation. As with all of the psychological analyses that I do, I take a look at the background of the offender, their earlier life, to see if there's any clues that might have had an impact on their decisions to murder. Steve Wright was born in Norfolk, in England in 1958, and he's one of 4 children. His mum was a veterinary nurse and his dad was a military policeman. His parents had split up when he was 6, and all of the children lived with their father, who went on to remarry. There are several reports that Steve Wright's father was quite violent with the children, and he had himself suffered an abusive and violent upbringing as a child. Those who are abused and grew up in violent conditions sometimes learn this behaviour and then go on to become abusers themselves. I'm certainly not saying that all of those people who have been abused or suffered violence will inevitably go on to commit crimes themselves or to be violent themselves. However, what I am saying is that those who do abuse and are violent will probably have experienced it in some point in their lives themselves. This could be because it's a conditioned response that they've learned to behave in this way through experiencing and watching it themselves. Or it could even be a way of coping with the psychological trauma, and they're acting out due to some deep-seated resentment. The Evening Standard newspaper reported that his mother had left the family home and the children to go off with her younger lover. His mother didn't keep contact with the children either. Wright's aunt, who was his mother's twin, recalled how Steve used to sit outside on the curb all day waiting for his mum to return, and of course, she never did. She recalled in that interview for the paper that his mother contacted him after about 40 years to ask if they could meet. Steve Wright's aunt said she told me afterwards that the visit didn't go well. And a week after she'd returned home, Stephen called her and was shouting abuse down the telephone at her. The psychological factors that are significant so far in this case are that this was initially a frightened and confused little boy. He's likely to have felt abandoned by his mum. His elder brother confirmed that Steve Wright had experienced sexual and physical abuse as he was growing up. And this will have been at a time when he was missing his mother and unsure why she'd left them. Even before childhood, he was at risk, confused, vulnerable, and probably angry. So after finishing school, he joined the Merchant Navy and he worked as a chef on ferries sailing from Felixstowe to Suffolk. He went on to marry and he had a son, but then they divorced and he remarried shortly after that. His ex-wife had told reporters at the time that he'd attacked her with a knife on one occasion. Another time, he repeatedly banged her head against a wall, she said, and that was simply for folding the bedsheets the wrong way. And on a third occasion, he'd locked her in a room while he slept with 2 other women. He's reported to have had several different jobs throughout his life, and these jobs included being a lorry driver, a pub landlord, forklift truck driver. He went on to split up with his second wife not long after they got married while he was a pub landlord. He lost a job managing a pub because of his heavy alcohol use and the gambling problems that he had. The only prior conviction that Steve Wright has is for theft in 2001. He reportedly stole £80 to pay off his own debts. During his trial, he said that he'd used sex workers on many occasions, and that was dating back to his days in the Merchant Navy. And this paints a picture of him and his life so far as being somewhat dysfunctional. It's always psychologically very difficult when parents split up and the children live with one parent or the other. This can be managed very well in most cases though. However, if there's no contact or intermittent contact or derogatory comments are made by one parent about the other one, then it becomes quite damaging to the children involved. And when this is combined with the sexual and the physical assaults from the remaining parents, it caused a deep psychological trauma. As an adult, it's clear that he was abusing alcohol and he had a gambling addiction. The majority of people who misuse alcohol are using it to mask some sort of pain. It's a form of escapism. These individuals can't cope with life on life's terms for whatever reason that might be. With gambling, when you win, you get a really high spike in dopamine, which feels very pleasurable. Even though the losses make you feel really low, a person would then continue to get those high spikes and it becomes quite addictive. It is evident that Steve Wright was a very depressed man. He attempted to commit suicide on 2 occasions. The first time he tried to kill himself with carbon monoxide in his car was in 1994 after he split from his first wife. The second attempt was taking an overdose in pills in 2000. Steve Wright then met Paula Wright, who was no relation at the time, in 2001, and they moved in together. He openly admitted to using sex workers and to visit brothels. He would take sex workers back to their home while she was working night shifts. After Wright was arrested for the murders, she didn't believe that he'd done it and she vowed to stay by his side. He even proposed marriage to her from behind bars. While Wright was in prison, he sent his father a letter which read, "Whenever I get upset, I tend to bury it deep inside," which I suppose isn't a healthy thing to do, because the more I do that, the more withdrawn I become, because I've seen too much anger and violence in my childhood to last a lifetime. So psychologically, this is a man who was something like akin to shaking a bottle of fizzy pop, which had been shook so much that the top was just bursting off it. He will have suppressed his emotions so that they turned to anger, and they absolutely consumed him. He did have a great deal of difficulty sustaining a relationship, and he was violent and abusive towards women in general. After his mother had contacted him all those years later, he called her and he left very abusive messages for her. It is clear that this is a man who had trust issues with women, and he didn't have much respect for women in general. Steve Wright will have had difficulty forming relationships with women. He was unable to relate to them. His ongoing use of sex workers indicates that he saw women as being objects which were there to be used to fulfill his own desires. Wright would have found it extremely difficult to form emotional ties with women. And this may have started with his mother leaving. However, it was certainly then reinforced by ongoing use of sex workers that did whatever he wanted them to do. Between the 30th of October and the 10th of December 2006, Wright murdered 5 sex workers in Ipswich. Forensic evidence led to his arrest on the 19th of December. At the time of the murders, Wright was working as a forklift truck driver. He was found guilty of all 5 murders in 2008. He was then sentenced to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he should serve a full life term. I think this is one of those really sad cases because early intervention could have prevented these needless deaths. All of the warning signs were there, but for some reason nothing was done to help or support him when he was growing up. Perhaps authorities never noticed that he was physically and sexually abused as a child. However, in the era he would have been a child, it was fairly acceptable in those years to hit children, and adults were right no matter what. During the time that he was married, women were still sometimes seen to be subservient to their husbands. It was quite rare for women to leave or for them to report their husband's abuse. Although things were missed and interventions could have prevented the deaths of these women, That is easy to say in retrospect. It's only when we have an opportunity like this to look back over the individual's life for those psychological clues that led him to kill that we see this destructive pattern of abuse and neglect. Wright is still being investigated in connection with other unsolved murders and disappearances. He's one of a number of high-profile murderers or sex offenders to have been identified as possible suspects in the Susie Lamplugh case. He'd worked with Lamplugh on the QE2 ocean liner during the early 1980s. Lamplugh went missing in London in July 1986 and was legally declared dead in 1994, but her body has never been found. It's also possible that he may have been responsible for the murder of Vicky Glass, who vanished from Middlesbrough in 2000. Thanks very much for joining me and listening to this psychological analysis of Steve Wright today. I do hope that you've learned something from it. Don't forget you can support me on Patreon, starting from the price of a cup of coffee, and you get access to exclusive content. If you do want to take part in one of my online courses, all of those are on my website and you can take a look at those. So thanks for listening then. Bye for now.